Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, belugas and their babies, a journey to the Churchill River. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader Kristina Disney. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you for being here with us today. Take it away, Kristina.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Before I launch into our webinar, there is someone I want to give a shout out to. This is very exciting. One of our fellow guides here at NatHab, another expedition leader, Leah, this very morning has just finished her master's defense on the sound acoustics in the Arctic Ocean, focusing on narwhals. So wherever you are, I know she won't be able to hear you, but you want to give her a quick round of applause. That has been years in the making. You might have even been guided by Leah if you've come to Churchill in the past. This is a really huge accomplishment. She's put a lot of really beautiful effort and work, and having, worked alongside her for the last few years, no joke, she has in between NatHab trips been like literally going through sound bites and sound clips, working things out. So um, wherever you might be, if you want to take 10 seconds and do a quick round of applause for her, very proud of the work she's done and very excited to keep learning from her and alongside her. So shout out to one whale and one researcher, and we are going to shift over to our focus of today, which are belugas, some of the most charismatic animals out there in the whole wide world. And very excited to get to share some of their story and hopefully we'll be kind of looking at some of the specifics of Churchill, but really, I was really taken with just the whole sort of whale culture and whale society. So we're going to take a really broad view of that today, and that's what we're going to take the time to focus on. So first of all, where are we going to find belugas up there in the big wide north, right? Well, if you look at this map, this is actually a really great one. So this is showing us, it's not delineating them, but there are 16 different, what we're going to call stocks or populations. It's always funny how different words are different for different animals, right? Is it a parliament of owls? Is it an aurora of polar bears? When we're talking about belugas, we wouldn't call them herds or the same way that you would call a killer whale pods. Well, you can use pods sometimes, but again, words are always funny that way. So, but what I want to show you here, and I want you to look at the different colors, is that a really important thing is that they migrate. They have summer and wintering grounds. And then there are a few smaller populations, those kind of orange, goldy color in there, that are resident, which means that they don't ever leave. They're a much more localized population. And there are benefits to both ways of living. Same way with humans, right? We have lots of different societies, lots of different ways that we move through the world. What I want to focus in on today is on Churchill, or here more just directly Hudson's Bay here. So Churchill is this little nook kind of tucked in here. It's probably not the way you're used to looking at the world, right? We don't often look at it from the Arctic down. But it's always good to change perceptions and look at different maps that way. And so for the Hudson's Bay, there are approximately 55,000 belugas that come into the bay every summer. Those are in three distinct subpopulations or stocks. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of those. But then what happens is all of those then, when winter comes, they travel out into that dark blue kind of Hudson Strait in above Quebec here. And going down into Labrador. So that's where they have to go into wintertime. And we'll talk about why they have to make such a big, travel such a distance. But again, some of these populations are staying as residents. Some of them are traveling as far as 6,000 kilometers annually, right? Making that trek back and forth. So when we think about that and we think about placing belugas in that, I'm going to back us up a little bit, work through a little bit of life history here. But we have a very strong affinity for cetaceans, for whales, right? They're very charismatic, they're very intelligent. You know, the expressions that we see in them, whether we're anthropomorphizing that or not. But I always sort of think it's interesting when we roll back the clock and when we do think about the role that they fill, right? So they're an aquatic predatory mammal, right? It's always kind of a wild thing to think about evolution, of deciding to leave the ocean, make your way on land, and be like, nope, sorry, I take it back. We're going back to the ocean. We're going to go back to living in that. And then forming these really amazing and complex societies. So Today, what we have, right, so we have two species, we have one species of beluga, but they exist within the larger family of the Monodontidae, which is the same as the narwhal. That's kind of why I want to do a bit of a shout out to Leah and her work. So they're the only two extant or living species that we have left of those. So kind of what you and I know of today as a beluga, that's something that's really only existed for the last 15 million years, give or take a little bit. Um, and they are one category of whale, or one, we could break them down into two, right? So when we think about all of the big, beautiful whales that we have, and also little, beautiful whales that we have out in the world, right? Remember, dolphins are also whales. We can split them into two bigger groups. So either they are odontidae, which means that they are toothed whales. They have a single blowhole, right? These ones, they're generally hunting by echolocation. And there's a lot more species of these in the world today. There's about 76 versus the Mysticeti or the baleen whales, right? So they have it's made out of keratin, the same thing that your fingernails are made out of, essentially. And those are big, big whales, but those are now filter feeders. And there's far fewer of those. There's only about 14 species of those. And they actually have a dual blowhole. And then again, that structure underneath for the expansion and the filtering, right? So to be able to have those throat grooves and be able to expand. So belugas are one of our toothed whales, friends. I was trying to say teeth plural there. Working on that one, hey? And so I always think I go back to a memory I had in the Royal BC Museum here on Vancouver Island, and I walked into a display on killer whales or on orcas, and I was so terrified of the skeleton because when we look at them, covered in flesh, they do feel very mammalian, very familiar. But when you break it down and you look at their skeleton, this one is a crocodile, but I just want to show this for comparison, right? There's something reptilian that we don't human wise identify with as much. When we are thinking about this is maybe a silly comparison, but those like the Transformer bots and the good and the bad ones sort of look like insect or reptilian, and the good ones look more mammalian, right? Well, if you pull back the skin on a beluga, and if you take away that cute layer of skin and blubber, they still very much reptilian when we break that down. And so I find that it's kind of an interesting notion of people so easily have an affinity for whales, but yet have a struggle having a connection to crocodiles. So I'm just throwing this as a challenge. Maybe if you're not a fan of reptiles, but you're a fan of whales, you could extend some of that love and adoration, or vice versa. But I wanted to break it down to that very basic level of that skeletal level, because again, both of these groups of whales, teeth whales and baleen whales, are forming either top predators or they're intermediate predators, right? So if they're those filter feeders, they're not necessarily these apex predators, but a lot of these other whales are sort of midway up the food chain, or in the case of things like orcas, right there at the top. And so again, when you think about food source, that also then thinks about how your lifestyle works, right? So baleen whales are really strong migrators, right? And not saying that toothed whales don't undergo also structured migrations, but they're a little bit less timed, or they're a little bit less in sync, just because they're not quite so tied to that boom and bust cycle, because they're using echolocation as a hunting form instead. So what does this all have to do with moms and babies, right? Well, when we think about whales, and we really can call them cetacean societies, which even that is just fun to say. When we think about how they hunt and how their life cycle works for toothed whales, so that's what belugas belong to, right? They have some of the most extensive maternal care that happens in the world of cetaceans, and really in the world of mammals, right? So the mother and the calf, that relationship is at the core of their whole society. And moms, again, I'm really just saying something everyone knows, but we're playing that pivotal role in the reproduction, the survival of offspring, everything from gestation, lactation, and then that weaning and post-weaning care. And I think that's probably a bigger difference between our two whales, if we think about baleen whales versus toothed whales, is that there is a lot of post-weaning care. There's a lot of maternal, but also cultural care that happens as these whales grow up in that really long life cycle that they have. And so that's what we're going to investigate a little bit today. So the first part, or something I kind of want to think about, or maybe change for a second, is that when we're thinking about familial bonds, when we're thinking about, why does a wolf hunt in a pack? Why do beetles have so many eggs? When we think about things like this, right? Like when we think about reproduction structures and strategies, we can really think about one of the things that we use in evolution as a driving force or as a means of investigation is competition for food. Like, how does that work? What is their availability, right? And that tug of war in an ecosystem really sets up a lot of precedents for what different niches can get filled. Now, on land, we, there's resource defense, there is territory, right? But in the water, that really changes all of a sudden. Same is true for in the air, but we'll focus on whales here for now. When you're in a three-dimensional fluid, uh, low energy cost of travel, right? So it's way easier to get around. And two, you can't really defend a resource, right? I mean, it's if your food is mobile, it's not really going to be something that you can hold on to, or and so that really changes how a structure has to work. And so that's when I'm going to introduce kind of two different ideas of motherhood then. So if you're a mom and you need to have enough resources to raise a calf, right, in this case, there's kind of two different strategies. We could either call them capital breeders or income breeders. We're getting into a little bit of ecology definitions here, but it's sort of fun. So we'll stick with it just a little bit. So if you're an income breeder, it means that you need to be eating at the same time as you are raising your child or raising your calf, right? Energy in, energy out. You often rely maybe a bit more on starches and proteins rather than just fats. Whereas if you're a capital breeder, it means that you got as big, as chubby and fat as you possibly could, and then you're going to use that energy to raise your young until you can then start eating again or start eating more regularly, right? So again, these things they're not totally opposite. The same species will kind of ultimately form from one into another potentially, right? They'll put on a little bit of weight, have the baby, vice versa. But there's different strategies for how it is you're going to access those resources. Now, another complication, if you're going to be mama-citation, is cold and temperature, right? So just think about like the extra challenge of trying to keep a newborn baby warm if you were in the water, right? And obviously whales have evolved for literally millions of years to deal with this challenge, but it's kind of a crazy notion, right? That is something you have to start worrying about right from the get-go. And so a really big focus is transferring as much energy from the mother's body to the calf's body in the form of fat, right? So if you look at pinnipeds, cetaceans, so it's like things like seals, whales, right? The fat concentration or percentage on that is way, way higher. Some people here might, be drinking 3% milk or not skim milk. So for us, if we're having cow's milk, that's maybe 3%. If you're a whale, that's usually anywhere between anywhere from about 15 to 50%. But let's say on averaging about 30% fat, right? So there's a lot of energy getting transferred over there. And most of that is just to be able to stabilize core heat temperature. So all in all, when we look at the root of our whales and we look at our beluga whales, it really is that our moms are the cornerstone of this, right? They are what set everything up for the future. Paternal care, as far as we know, is completely absent. It has yet to be recorded. There is communal care, but we'll get to that maybe a little bit later. Right? But it's a very intense form, very similar to us, right? Even in some of not quite in some of the sheer length of it, but we'll see how long they're taking care of their calves for shortly, right? But it's lasting from months to multiple years. And when we look at whale reproduction strategy, it's a very low reproduction rate. They have a singular calf, and that investment in that one calf is a huge it's a huge investment. And really that's representative of the mother's own fitness, right? So the care of offspring is what she's pushing for there. So it's not just the moms though, right? When we look at these different societies and we look at them, when you have a matriarchal cis-centered society, there is often communal care or what we would call female kinship relationships. And so it's not even that it's just you are solely responsible for the raising of your offspring, but the pod that they're traveling in, that group, right? The aunties will take care of them as well, right? And so it's a really, really kind of amazing thing to think about. And when we take that to the next step up, when we talk about sort of biology and function, another interesting step in that that's also comparable between humans is the function of menopause. So it's only, as far as we know as of right now, the only species that have menopause is us, and then 4 different whale species, including belugas. And so that implies that the role, right, of the female is not simply just for the reproduction of children, but that greater care of offspring is not just about birthing them and bringing them into adulthood, but it's about the transmission of knowledge. It's about passing on information from generation to generation that will then care for one another, which is pretty darn beautiful. This picture I think is hilarious. That is not a picture of me, but this is a picture of a big, beautiful, pregnant beluga. And so her pregnancy is going to last, or gestation lasts around 14 to 15 months. And so we think that generally breeding happens in the wintertime. And then once that calf is born, they're going to be spending about 2 years together until it's weaned. But during that time, right, so those young whales, they require a huge amount of energy from their mothers. They haven't achieved behavioral dependence yet. So they are born precocial. So that means that they can swim, they can, like, right from the get-go, right? But the success of whales is about their cultural success, right? And I hope that that's the one thing that you take out of today's webinar, is that that's where it comes from. And so these really long lifespans and this commitment to each calf singularly and passing on behavior is at the root of their whole culture and whole society. And so that's where we get this line of essentially matrilineal descent. So if you have a stable matrilineal line, it means that you are passing on the same genes, but it also means that you're passing on the same core amount of knowledge. And this is where we get essentially the emergence of culture, right? If you have fragmented family groups, it changes how knowledge gets passed along. But when you are living in these sort of tight-knit units, right? The average pod's anywhere from 2 to 5, sometimes 10 to 20, but also these massive, massive groups that gather literally in the thousands. So if you thought that your family Christmas was chaotic, trust me, you should show up at a beluga summer spree. It'll be a whole different world. But that passing on of ecological knowledge gets passed down behaviorally. But we also think that some of, the more we dig into genetics, there's all these really cool crossovers. And so I just want to talk about the difference between nuclear DNA and mitochondrial DNA, and how we think that the passing on of mitochondrial DNA has to do with actual how genetics affect culture. So what in the world do I mean by all that? We're used to thinking about DNA as I get half from my mom, half from my dad, and that makes up the whole that is me. And that's true when we're talking about the nucleus of our cells, right? So in that is absolutely true. You get half from each parent and you're equally represented. Now, inside of our cells, the little generators that produce all of our energy are called our mitochondria. And those actually have their own unique set of DNA. And those are not equally shared. Those we get from our mother's mother's mother as the line goes along. And so it's always an exact copy, or not exact copy, but it's looped from there passed down. And so that means that if our mother's mother's mother has a certain way of doing things, maybe she has a certain way of cutting the turkey or a certain way of cutting the ham, it's not just that we behaviorally learned it from her, it's that we actually could have genetically be predisposed for that certain behavior. So if that's a successful matriarch, right, then those are the behaviors that get passed forth. Right. So as a quick aside joke, I look very much like my great grandmother Aquina at a certain age. Right. And so though, like, you could argue that, yes, in total, I very much share 50-50 from my mom and my dad. But my mom's mom, I certainly have a lot in common with, which is pretty cool and amazing. Now, when we transfer this now into the world of belugas, the argument would be that it's not so much always, it really decentralizes the individual survival, and it heightens the community sense of survival. I think this is a lot more commonly known for people when we think about orcas, right? The really strong matrilineal line, grandma's in charge, everyone listens to her, and then mom will be in charge after. Belugas have a more loose formation of that. So when we think about belugas, they frequently associate with ones that are distant cousins, half siblings, ones that are actually not even super related. They have a much more loose congregation. The congregations can come and go, join and rejoin. And so again, this is now a really cool example because this compares belugas more closely to humans. Um, the assumption, if I'm going to go back to menopause for a second, so the assumption of menopause is that you're contributing to your own line's genetic success. But when we look at that in the other whale species, so when that happens for orcas, it's very much I'm taking care of my own family. Whereas humans, when we have menopause, you're not necessarily taking care of your own family. You can be taking care of anyone's family, and that's still considered a success, which is more similar to the roles that we're seeing, roles played, by belugas. So belugas have a far more wider community structure. It's not just their own children or their own nieces and nephews that they're taking care of or participating in the care of. It's much broader than that. And they also undergo menopause. So this is kind of one of those cool things where we don't have a perfect answer for it in science. We think that energy wise, based on just the laws of things, this doesn't make sense for belugas to have menopause and take care of whales that are not their own, or to have a community that is not so genetically similar. Now, again, it might just be a human construct because we can't see the world or hear the world the way they could. So maybe, acoustically, they're still connected to their family, even though they're in a broader community group. But at least at face value, it goes to show that there are still things that are not solved, and then not everything has to be quite as logical as working it down to simple survival, right? There's living life and there's being alive, and those things are always very different. So I think belugas do a cool job of exampling that. And it does come through community. So they do have a mother calf unit, and the matriarch does form the loose base for the community, but the community it's a lot more fluid. And so those dyads of mom and calf, they make it up. But an interesting thing here in comparison from belugas also to other whale species, and also right, is that both males and females are really faithful to their community. So what I mean by that is that in comparison, and a lot of things we're more familiar with, right? Like when a subadult male goes into adulthood, in a lot of other species, right, he gets pushed out because of breeding rights, because of right, and so, but in beluga communities, the males often still stay within their original community. The breeding pressure is not the same because, again, I was talking about those summer and wintering grounds. In the summertime, they're all hanging out in their selected community, but in the wintertime, they overlap so much and with other ones that there isn't that genetic pressure, or it opens up the playing field, we could say. It's very social time. Winter is a very social time. And so they're allowed then to keep that same structure overall. So it's just a very cool, different example of cooperation and of different social networks. And these relationships last for a really long time, right? So belugas have a lifespan potentially anywhere from about 60 to 80 years. And we didn't actually know that for a long time, by the way. We thought that most belugas only live to be about 40. And it wasn't until this study came through, which was by Stewart and all here. And it was really cool because this was from 2006, by the way. So that's when we figured out that belugas actually live twice as long as what we originally thought they could. What they had done was they went and they looked at old teeth that they'd had, and they looked at the count of the growth rings. So in the same way that, you look at a tree for the growth rings, and actually this is a perfect example to compare it to. If you look at a tree and the growth rings, there's a light and a dark, a light and a dark. And it's kind of summer, winter. And so you get that seasonality. And so for other whale species, you have 2 layers put on per year. But when they went and they actually looked at the radiocarbons, so the radioisotopes from the atomic bond testings that were done in the 1950s, which was still found in these teeth and these growth layers, they realized that they weren't putting on 2 layers per year, they were only putting on 1. So up until 2006, we had half the estimate age of what most of our whales were. So the reality is they live a very comparable lifespan to us, which is kind of amazing. So now if you think about having a really strongly connected community, and being able to hold those community relationships for literally decades, which is then what we get to see. So this is kind of a cool study. I won't go into it too much, but what essentially this is showing you is it's showing you relationships between different genealogies, and the first one shows you from year to year. The second, or sorry, within 1 year, who's hanging out with who. So if you look at the colors at the bottom, blue is your unrelated, orange is your half sibling, gray is your full sibling, and that yellow at the top is your parent to offspring, right? So really, there's quite a few that you hang out with that are not related to you, but there's a very consistent band of your siblings and your half siblings, and then of course that mother-child relationship. And what's cool is that it's maintained over decades. right? So when we're looking at some of these migratory routes, and they've done different tagging studies, they have seen, it might be days or weeks or even months between a mom and a half sibling or, two siblings moving through, but they are following the same routes. And then when they're arriving at the same places, right? So that is an inherited behavior, even if it's not directly happening in that moment, which is so freaking cool, I think, to see, and to see that strength of community literally over decades, right? That's what we all kind of hope for in our own human lives, is to really have, strong community and strong connection. Okay, so let's take some of those relationships and let's put it into the context of Hudson's Bay and of Churchill here. So we're just going to break this down for a second. So gray is the total area that you would find the three populations that go into Hudson's Bay. But we're going to focus on the Western Hudson's Bay now. We're going to focus on the ones that are going to go into Churchill. So that's that black. So if you look, Churchill is just this little kind of sticky out point right here, kind of like a shelf hanging out on the western side, and that's the Churchill River coming in there. And so this is what we would call the Western Hudson Bay population. And they're summering anywhere between the Nelson River, sort of up here to Churchill, and kind of the Seal River. And if you come to Churchill, there's about, well, depending on how you want to look at it, maybe 3,000 to 4,000 belugas that come and hang out and spend about 6 weeks in the mouth of the river with us, which is a pretty amazing thing. Very excited about it, about next summer. And so when we look at the arrows now, so we're going to look at what their migratory route looks like. And also this white in the area does indicate that they're not going there, or that there are less of them. And I want to come back to this because this is important. But for now, let's just look at the arrows. So, okay, so spring migration. So that means that winter is ending. So in the springtime, most of them are coming down in through the Hudson Strait. They're coming in potentially in along the east side. And then when fall comes and it's time to leave again, then they're heading back out. So they're either going in along, again, following the coast to the north, or those white arrows and going in along the east side, and then going and spending their winter out sort of more towards Ungava Bay, Cumberland Sound, and sort of more open, kind of the top part of Quebec and Labrador there. So when in the wintertime, right, I said winter is the time where all these different communities, these different pods are going to overlap in this more dense area here, sort of up south of Baffin Island. And so that is when most of our breeding is going to happen. So when we think again about males, in general, the pods are mixed sex, especially with subadults, but there are pods of all males or mature males and subadult males that will go off on their own. And when they go off, they are hunting in deeper waters. There's sort of a risk factor there, right? So they're more exposed to predation. They also go further north. They risk more in the ice pack, but potentially also higher food reward with that as well. But then they will travel back with the females sort of in that summertime as well. So there's a bit of segregation, but not necessarily a hard and fast rule. And if you were very curious, how do I tell the difference between a female and a male beluga? You want to look essentially for the genital grooves, right? So the female is going to have two going off at 45-degree angles, where the male is having a single slit there. So when we think about those males, right? Oh, yes. So they're traveling further north, swimming in deeper water, but they're still part of the community and part of the culture. So another interesting study that was pointing out was that, we were talking about females who are helping establish those migratory routes as social cues and as societal norms, but it's still also the role of some of those males to fill that as well. And so, the benefits of existing in a society, right? So when you're traveling in groups, the calves can go in a safer position within all of them. And if we shift then and think about the females, so our females are going to be becoming sexually mature around sort of 8 to 13 years old, right? Which is quite a long time. But again, now remember, we are getting in comparison, well, biologically at least, rather comparable to humans, right? Lifespan of 80, hitting puberty around 13. So some interesting comparisons sort of kicking in there. And they are going to nurse their young for about 2 years. So that's going to set up a bit of that breeding competition. So what I mean by that is that in a population of beluga whales, right, there is an equal number of females and an equal number of males. But if you're a mom and you have a calf for a roughly 2.5 to 3 year cycle, it means that you're only interested in breeding one every 3 years. And so that's what creates male to male competition for breeding rights. Now, given that it's Christmas and maybe you are looking for some fun games to play with your family over the holidays, or maybe need a little bit of downtime into to yourself, if you wanted to, you could look up beluga bits and you could participate in this very cool, very fun citizen science project, which is working to identify and sex different belugas using the cameras that are set up in Churchill. So this is run through with the explore.org if you want to look this up, or just type in beluga bits and Google it. And so they're in the summertime, there are cameras that are actively recording them, and they're looking to sex them based off of the little descriptors that I just gave you before, looking for genital lines. Also for scars, right? So while it is very hard to tell belugas apart, they can have very identifying scar features, and those can be used then to create a library and track things like habitat preference, social structure, life history. So if you want to do a little bit of science this Christmas, maybe you have a bit of time, I very much encourage you to go and look up the beluga bits. Okay, but let's bring it back. So I was talking before, there are 3 stocks that are going to be showing up in Hudson's Bay. And they always get named for their summer ground. So they might be mixing in the wintertime, but they're going back to certain locations in the summertime. And so we know that males will sometimes disperse from that. So when we think about gene flow between these populations, that's primarily male driven versus female driven. There's a lot of what's the word I want? There is a lot of it'll come back to me. Let's see. Oh my gosh, totally gone. That's okay. Happens. Okay, but I want to talk about distribution of what's driving this fall spring drive, right? Why is it they're bothering to migrate? And loyalty. Oh my gosh, it took so long to pull that word out of my brain. There's a lot of loyalty to migration routes. Okay, so why is it that they're being forced to migrate? Why do they have these routes? Sorry, that was too funny. That took my brain so long to figure out. Why don't they just stay in one place, right? Well, a lot of that is sea ice driven. And so belugas, right? So they are able to maintain holes that are open, but as the sea ice comes in, they're not like the big bowhead whales that can smash through and keep their own breathing holes open. Belugas really are reliant on natural ice flows. They can hold their breath for about 25 minutes. But that being said, belugas do not want to get trapped in an iceful Hudson's Bay. They get trapped away from food sources. They're much more prone to predation by polar bears or by humans, right? Both are natural predators. At least in the wintertime. In the summertime, killer whales are also a predator that comes into the bay and looking for them. And so ice is a big driver. As much as they are an ice-loving species in the sense that they've evolved to live near the ice, they can't live by a totally ice-dominated environment. They need to have some of those currents held open. So even if you look at the top of Hudson's Bay here, right, you can just see there's a net, like the way the current formed, that is being held open. So those are places that they're going to seek out. And so they leave every year. Like when we show up for polar bear season in Churchill in October, you might see the odd male that's sort of left behind, but out of years of doing it, I've seen like 3 or 4, right? It's very, very rare. So normally they hightail it out of there, sort of end of in September or August or early August, late August, end of September. Second driver is diet, right? So what are our belugas eating? So again, lots of different fish species, different cod, capelin are feeding into that food network. So that would be called pelagic. So that's what they're hunting from the open water. But they're also eating a lot of benthic species. So those are the ones that are living along the bottom. That can be invertebrates. That can be sandworms, crabs. They will eat squid and octopus. That's what you're sort of seeing in this bottom left corner here, is you're seeing a beluga suck up a squid, which, by the way, they don't chew things, right? So because they essentially suction everything in, and they don't chew anything because it has to do with the way that their teeth are. And I hope that you are laughing wherever you are at home, because when I first saw this, I just about died. It's kind of one of those things where once you see it, you can't unsee it. And while we tend to think of belugas as very, very cute, this is like, when you look at it this way, this is the most alien way of ever seeing them. So if you were about to be a fish eaten by a beluga, this is the last thing that you would see. So those teeth that they have they've got about 40. They're not designed for chewing, they're designed for catching, and then they suction whatever their prey is. And they suction in things alive too, so maybe not the greatest way to go. And they can either do that cruising along the benthic floor, trying to suck up little bits. They can also be diving, right? So most depths we would say are about 100 feet, so maybe 30 meters as an average. They are very much capable of diving up to about maybe 800 meters, so in that sort of 2,000 feet range. But there has to be a food source and a driver for that. And so their foraging tactics rely on more shallow water as a general rule of thumb. And when they're hunting, they're going to be using echolocation, right? So people might have heard this expression before. Sometimes belugas get called the canaries of the sea. And part of this comes from sailors. They used to be able to hear the belugas singing in the hulls of the ship. That's how much noise they were making. But the canary nickname comes from not just the noise, but the range of noises. So because they can actually change the shape of their melon when they change the shape of their lips, which is very cute. And they have a huge, huge range of vocalizations, kind of like crows, or maybe better comparison is ravens, right? They have so many different sounds that they can make. And then they use those different sounds for different things. So a hungry whale, what they'll do is they send out a series of clicks, and then they switch between search mode, which is sort of a passive, slow movement where they're just sending out clicks and listening. And then when they get hunt mode, they have a lot more of these sort of very speedy, accelerated, quickly changing courses to hone in on the prey that they've located. Now, a cool thing about belugas that's a bit unique to them compared to some other whales is that they don't have a fused vertebrae. So if you look at other whales, they don't turn their head. You and I take this for granted all of the time, that we can turn our heads because we have access to that. So beluga whales do have the ability to slightly rotate their head, and it's also why we find them so charismatic a little bit, because they have a lot of facial expressions, they move their lips a lot, and they turn their heads, and so there's this sort of like caricature that comes out of this. And if anyone hasn't figured it out yet, this is from my favorite movie of all time, Princess Bride, where, making your head move a little bit, you should be happy. Absolutely, you're a beluga. You should be very, very happy that you can turn your head. Okay, but let's go back to hunting. So they can turn their heads, so that's an advantage for when they're trying to catch prey. And then they're relying on the melon, which is it's a specified type of fat or oil that they have, or that's what gets rendered down into oil. It's a specialized type of fat that then those clicks go out, and same as a bat echolocation, that sound comes back to them, and then that vibration helps them locate their prey. They don't have to just use their own clicks. We think they can use other belugas' clicks as well to time some of that. We also think this is how they find different pressure densities in the ice when they're looking for a breathing hole. So not just for hunting, but for sort of whole life. This is what they're using for. And so when they're swimming, you'll often find it's a bit of a slow rolling pattern. And we think that also is something that helps with that echolocation and that identification. Sorry, excuse me. One thing that is a bit different from these whales, on this whale, you'll notice they don't have a dorsal fin, right? So again, that's being adapted for sea ice. But also they're a much less aerial species than someone compared to, say, a killer whale or humpback. They will do a little bit of spy hopping, that like looking up and down, the odd tail slap, but in general, they do most of their communicating and their displays in the water. One thing that is kind of funny is that when they get annoyed, they will do a blowing bubble display to express their aggravation, which I cannot get enough of. I think that's hilarious. How do we learn a lot of this stuff, right? I think how we come to learn things is often as interesting as what it is we're trying to learn, and also giving appreciation for what it took to do that, right? So this is, and you know what, I am going to take a minute to point some of this out. So this is actually a telemetry piece that's put on. And so, right, you can see that it is physically attached, right? And we're working on getting better ways into this, but you can see the bolt holes into the skin, right? Now, is that comparison to me getting my ears pierced? Maybe, maybe not. When you think about the scale of the animal, did I choose to get my ears pierced? Yes. Did the whale choose to get telemetry? No. But it's always an interesting thing of individual good versus greater good for a species, right? The things that we're learning about these are what we're using to push management. So as long as we always keep pushing to do better, That's my opinion of it. But little by little, we're getting places as far as we can. So what I wanted to actually share is direct observations from a study done from Cook Inlet. So that's over on the Alaska side, because I think it's really cool getting to directly read like what the researchers were observing from some of these studies. So this was 7 different whales that had acoustic gear put on so they could listen to them hunt. So all 7 data sets show similar characteristics, with an initial escape mode after release. No vocalizations or echolocations. These whales emitted a series of echolocation click trains immediately after release, likely in search of deeper water and escape rates, but remained completely quiet for extended periods, on average 3.7 hours, before echolocation was used again. No calls or whistles were emitted until a beluga group was rejoined, on average from 5 to 5.6 hours after release. The researcher remarks, it's surprising how these belugas managed to navigate without the use of echolocation for such an extended period, considering the extreme turbidity levels in the bay. 3 of the 7 tagged whales resumed feeding before rejoining a beluga group. The rest did not feed until a group of belugas was joined. 1 tagged whale never joined other belugas in the 13.5 hours of data obtained until the tag was released. For all tagged whales, feeding behavior involved intense echolocation activity and little to no vocal activity. Feeding behavior was observed at very shallow depths of 0 to 2 meters, that's about 6 feet, over mud flats only accessible at high tide periods. In occasions, however, feeding behavior followed a more typical dive and surfacing sequence, where the whale would dive for short periods of 2 to 4 minutes at depths ranging from 3 to 10 meters, so about 9 to 30 feet, give or take, in river channels or outside of the coastal mudflats. However, the intense echolocation occurred both at the surface and at the diving, which is in contrast to other coastal toothed whales. So I just think that's really cool because we don't often, well, one, we don't often get to observe these things even with our eyes, even if we were up there, right? It does take having that equipment on them to really learn, where they're going and what they're searching for. So think about that. Most of that was really shallow water. And these whales are living in really right on the edge, right? I've talked about this before, if anyone tuned into any of the Pacific Northwest ones that we've done, but the intertidal zone, like that is a place of abundance, right? So these whales have really geared their existence around that. And yes, they do hunt in deeper waters, but especially when they have young, right? They're more driven to these coastal ones. So just kind of some cool imagery for that, or trying to visualize sound is always a tricky thing. But this is some of that echolocation foraging behavior that they were talking about. So the top one shows you the frequency, energy is voltage, and then ICI stands for interclick interval. So how quickly they're clicking off. So if you just look at, I know the pink and the green is the exciting part, but if you just look at the bottom line here with me, so these are the searching clicks, or this is the right looking for, and then that terminal buzz at the end is when they're clicking so fast, and then it ends. And there's a really fun, this is the ending part of the researcher's notes I'm going to read. Feeding terminal buzzes always end with a prey crunch sound, a jaw clap, or a short period of silence until echolocation activities resume. So the jaw clap is like, I missed, didn't get it, right? Or like, because they have the sound gear on the whale, they get to hear the crunch at the end, which I just think is kind of cool. Very exciting. You can tell I'm definitely on the side of the beluga, not on the side of the fish. Hey. Okay. They don't always hunt alone. They can hunt with their pods, so they can have a concerted effort. That'll often be with schools of fish. They'll drive them closer to the shoal, and then individual belugas will take a turn going for them while the other ones are holding them in a tighter packed group. And so I want to bring us back to this map, and I want us to think about what we've learned in terms of female kinship, of matrilineal dominated society, of successful hunting habits, the prey that they're looking for, and the behavior of that. And I want you to look at this map again, and I want you to think about a couple things. Why are there no whales in the middle, right? And how is it that society is driving this distribution? So for the females, they are sticking to more coastal waters. They're hunting at shallower depths in general. compared to males that are going off further, right? Because it's a safer place to raise their young. They have been taught that by their mothers and their grandmothers and their aunts and their cousins, that this is the way we travel and this is the way we get in and out. That's where the food abundance is, right? And so it's a little bit of like chicken and egg. Was the culture there because that's where the food was? Is the food, or or have they followed it and that's what's made it that way? But it's really, really cool to see that that comes in and out of their annual migration, right? So it's not that there isn't any food in the center of Hudson's Bay. I want to get rid of that notion completely. There definitely is, but it's at a slightly deeper depth. So the deepest part, I got to do math here, is around 200 or 300 meters at its very, very deepest. Also, it's more exposed, right? So there are killer whales that would be the main prey of predators, of belugas that would be coming in here and trying to make some moves on them. And so you're getting to now see what was before literally a black and white or gray map. I'm hoping you're starting to see some color painted into this of how these whales are managing. Now, when we're talking about whales traveling, this is a study from the other side, so more the Churchill Sea, so above Alaska, but there is specific populations, right, of belugas over there. And it's just kind of showing the distance that some of these whales have covered. So some of them are able to cover thousands of kilometers in just a few months. They're swimming at a rate of about 2.5, or anywhere from 2.5 to 6 kilometers an hour. And so that mobile life also, it does also allow for prey to regroup when you're coming back, right? So if you think about bisons on the plain, they come and graze all the grass, and then you move back and find a different swath, right? So oceans are a little bit more fluid, pun intended, but some of that is still kicking in as well. Okay, the time is getting away on me, but that's okay. We spent a lot of time talking about the adults. I still want to talk a little bit about the babies themselves, right? So they're born anywhere from usually June to September. Again, it was about a 14-month gestation period. And when they are born, or immediately afterwards, there's a spatial relationship that starts to happen between mother and calf. So the right after, what we call the neonates, the newborns, they take what we call the echelon position. So if we were terrestrial, it's that notion of you follow behind mom or you get carried beside her. And so this pose is where the mom sort of boosts the calf swimming and keeps her tucked in beside. And then once they're a little bit older, then they would switch into what's called more of an infant position. And so that's where they're under the mom's abdomen and kind of beside the tail, so a little bit further back. And this is at the cost of mom. So it's a good spot for protection, but it does have some hydrodynamic consequences. She has to swim a little bit more, but it means the baby has to swim a little bit less. It's also ideal for nursing, right? So again, those mammary glands are back there. So that's where the calf is going to be able to roll in and to nurse. But this is just a fun diagram also showing all of the different positions that they can take up, right? Then from nudging to following, things like that. Now, if you thought that raising a newborn baby was hard and they don't sleep very much, imagine with a newborn baby whose brain only sleeps at half, or half the brain sleeps at a time. So when you and I go to sleep, our whole brain takes a nap. But for cetaceans and for some fur seals and sea lions, they have unihemispheric sleep, which means that in order for them to sleep underwater, half their brain sleeps at the same time. And so that means that the babies are sleeping even less, right? Sort of as a fun joke, but really it's true. So mom sleeps almost very like so little the first few weeks and months, and then she has to start hunting too, right? So she needs to increase her caloric uptake by about 40% in order to be able to nurse and not have a detriment to her own body health. And so moms, what they're doing is they're shortening their dive times. Again, the reason for hunting in a lot of that shallower water is you can keep sight on your calf when you do a dive. They're spending more time at the surface to sort of accommodate that calf's mobility. And as the calf gets older, that separation time can increase little by little. Those little, let's see, it's so cute on the back. They can begin feeding on fish and invertebrates in that first year, but they'll continue taking milk up until around that 2.5 year mark. And sort of being able to start hunting for themselves. Again, catching fish, right? So I told you they suction things in and they eat them whole. So the size of the beluga's throat affects the food it can eat. So when it's little, things like keepling, sandworms, right? But as they get older, then they can hunt larger fish. They can go for cod. They can go for things like that. But because they're not chewing any of their food, they literally have to make sure that they don't pick something that's too big for their throat. Now that stereotypical white color that we think of as belugas, right? Beluga actually comes from the Russian word for white. That's where the root of the name does come from. So while they're no longer calves at around 2, like they get weaned at around that 2.5-ish mark, they keep that gray color into adolescence, right? So they don't stop being gray until around 8 or so. And so that gray is a higher amount of melanin in their skin, and then it does turn white later on. And so again, even though they're not being raised by mom, they've been weaned. In those first 8 years, that's when community is so exceptionally important. That's where they're learning these habits and these traits. And they're being accompanied with things like half siblings, right? Like your mom's older, or well, yeah, half siblings. They could even be the same sibling, but unlikely, right? So again, where siblings come into play. That's not something we talk about in a lot of different animal societies, but siblings are a huge, huge importance for belugas. And again, just kind of coming back to some of those cool things with teeth and growth layers. So that's how they're able to figure out when these calves are being weaned. They're able to look at the makeup of those teeth, of those different growth layers. Bring that back in. And okay, so when the sea ice recedes in the springtime, and all these animals are making this migration, what, in research, we're asking the question, what is the drivers to be traveling to this estuary? So on the map here, you're getting a look at, this is what the mouth of the Churchill River looks like. There's a picture of it, of a town, nice in the summertime. And in the middle here, this is a spot just near the weir. So you can kind of see all this big, and it is really brown, muddy water, right? It's got a lot of organics and nutrients coming in, which is what makes it so productive. And interestingly enough, when we think about these estuaries, why are they making the effort? And we have lots of theories about it, right? So it's because of the warmer water. It requires less energy. Remember how important it is to keep those babies warm? So it would require less energy. Also for the adults, they're going through a molt. So that's one thing that's unique about our cetaceans, is that they actually molt all of their skin, like a really bad sunburn kind of thing, type of molt, which is rare. Other whales sort of slowly slough their skin periodically. One theory for this, and this is personal theory, not so much a science one, but because they're white and they lack melanin, their skin gets damaged by the sun more, so they have to slough it more regularly, maybe is a better way to say it. Source of food, right? Those estuaries are bringing in lots of nutrients, highly productive zones as drivers. What's funny is we can't, as science, pull out one of those reasons and say, this is the ultimate reason why they do this. It's a little bit of each of those. And it's kind of good, I think, sometimes when science doesn't have all of the answers. But yes, sorry. And so the molting, that's what I wanted to show the picture of here. Right. So they get rid of that old skin, slough it off, and then have a reset. And so that's also a sensitive time because it takes a lot of energy to do that. For pinnipeds, for seals, they do that on shore or on top of the ice because doing it in the water costs so much. So that is a good driving reason for these whales to seek out warmer waters. And I know I'm almost at time here, but I just want to bring up a couple more things really quickly, which is just that when we're thinking about these really amazing societies, putting them into context of what's going on. So I want to put this in context of sort of geological history really quickly, which is just that these whales are extremely loyal to their migration routes. They're loyal to their communities and to their families. And so they don't change very much. If that's what grandma did, it's most likely what you're going to do to follow that route. And so when we're talking about this being sea ice driven, remember that where they're traveling to and from wasn't always possible or accessible, right? So these whales have been around for 14 million years. And if we go back 13,000 years ago, all of this was covered by the Laurentide ice sheet. So that wouldn't have been somewhere they were living. There is slow incremental change in those migratory routes. That's kind of what we can see here. If we look at this from the top, these are the current populations, but think about what this would have all been covered with in sea ice about 13,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago. So we can see that they have adapted. They have been able to change that. So over slow timescales, they are able to find new migratory routes. They're not picky eaters. They will 100% eat whatever they can get their hands on or whatever they can get their fins on. But there are changes that are happening that they can't keep up with. So when we think about trying to manage populations, and I don't even like saying manage it because when we think about how much society and structure they have, but when you think about trying to assist some of that, things like whaling can have huge generational consequences, right? These are animals that are living 80 years. They're relying on their aunts and their grandmas to teach them things. And if those are the whales that get pulled out of populations, there are areas that have been extirpated. So areas where the whales were hunted out. And it's not that the whales don't have access to it. It's not that there's any barriers, but culturally, there's no one to take them back to those places. So, the loss of a single generation can be the loss of literally hundreds of years of knowledge, which should have some very strong parallels to our human world. So just want to end it briefly with Shout out to Maggie Smith, Dame Maggie Smith. When we think about these, matriarchal societies, she passed away. She was in Harry Potter, very big hero of mine. But just acknowledging that when you take out a generation, you're taking out a generation of knowledge, and that there is a loss felt to the whole societal level. And that recolonization, is then limited by that. This is from WWF. It's showing the current annual range, and then these summer distributions. But for an example here, like this little one here in Cook Island Inlet, it's super threatened because those whales are not able to grow beyond that society or to have an inflow from other places. And so these 16 different subpopulations are really unique, and they have their own ways of living, and they have their own cultures, and I like to think they have their own stories. So just recognizing the time, I want to say thank you, everyone. Happy holidays, and hopefully there's time for a question or two.
All right, thank you so much, Kristina. Now, before we dive into some questions, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's get into some of these. So, what is the significance of the skin color? Is there an advantage or a disadvantage to the coloration?
Yeah, we think that's an Arctic adaptation to be able to blend in with the sea ice that they're right. So they can't get trapped under the sea ice, but as they go further, they're always living right on the edge of it. That's also the benefit of not having a dorsal fin, because then they can escape under the sea ice or under the sea pack where their predator, the orcas, cannot go. So yeah, camouflage seems to be the logic.
Gotcha, thank you. So, how is their eyesight?
It's actually pretty good. I think it would be comparable to ours. And an interesting thing is that they have good eyesight both above and below water, which is decent above water. So normally, like for us, because we have like a flat pupil versus if you go for a seal, they have a round spherical one. They're able to see underwater. So that's why we need air to be able to see. So I'm actually not entirely sure whether theirs is somewhere in between that or just for having a round spherical pupil, they can see better above than below compared to other semi-aquatic creatures. But yeah, eyesight is definitely a part of it for them. But again, echolocation is the primary, or sound is their primary means of navigating.
Gotcha, thank you for that. So the echolocation method, is the hunting similar to that of a bat, say?
Yeah, yeah, it's the same logic that's being used, right? It's the sound going out, and then amazingly, their brains are calculating time and distance to return of sound, as quickly as in real time, which is wild when you think about. I mean, I guess our brains can do amazing things too, but I'm just very in awe of that.
Absolutely, thanks. So would you describe the belugas as matriarchal like orcas, for instance?
Yes, so they are matriarchal like orcas, but they're less, I'm going to say they're less strict about it. So there's not like it's the technical word is they're matrifocal rather than matrilineal, which means that it's not a single line of moms who's boss, but that the mothers decide where we'll be going and what we'll be doing, and there's a loose community that forms around those. So you don't have to be directly related to be part of their community, but it'll be the moms that are just like the moms will do the general planning, but you don't have to be related to me to travel with me, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, it does. Thank you. Can you talk about what the size differences between length and weight between the babies and the males and the females?
Yeah, so our calves are being born in around a couple 100 pounds, and then the males are coming in about 5 meters. So what is that, about 15 feet? And then the females are generally slightly smaller. And again, yeah, these are big animals, right? Like we're talking about a couple 1,000 pounds here. So um, they're like, I don't know, like I think about looking at like a bull standing on land and then like stretching that out and putting fins on it, right? Like they're pretty, yeah, right. I mean, but again, that's the benefit of being in the water, right? Size. When we think about this evolutionarily speaking, the low cost of transport, the lower like increase of density means that you can just support larger bodies, which is why we have bigger mammals in the ocean than we have on land. If anyone's ever thought about that connection, um, it's because water allows you to do that.
Gotcha, thank you. So is it still legal to hunt whales?
Yeah, always a fun question. So depending on the country you're in, the answer to this might be different. But in Canada, subsistence hunting of belugas is still allowed. It is a very tied in cultural process. Also, these different subpopulations, I think it's important to note, are like for humans, we like to put things in groups because that's how we think about them and how we understand them. The reason why we delineate the 16 populations is then we make up different management rules around each of them. So some of these subpopulations I've been talking about today are range from at risk, endangered, or threatened. And so the ones that like the eastern Hudson's Bay population is struggling a lot more than the western one. So that one has far stricter hunting regulations around it, whereas the other one, the quota is different. Not saying that there isn't strong regulations on either of them, but um, yeah. So those for yeah. So like for our Inuit who live in the north, right? This has been a part of their culture and a part of way of living for thousands of years, and they've been doing it sustainably for thousands of years too. So always keep that in mind.
Great, thank you so much. Um, so, if breeding occurs when winter pods meet, do they form a couple despite migrating apart in the summer, or do they mate with different partners every few years?
They are polyamorous, polyandrous. I always mix up those two. They will, there's no, from year to year, there's no indication that it's the same mate. They have different mates. It seems to be every winter.
So, what if a beluga loses a tooth? Does it grow a new one back?
You know what? I don't know. I would guess not. Most mammals into adulthood, we don't have a adult teeth replacement. So as a juvenile, yes, but I actually don't know the for sure answer to that. I just know that in general, adult mammals don't get more teeth. Although I wish we did, maybe.
Gotcha. Well, thanks for tackling those questions. Unfortunately, that will be the last one that we do have time for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for your closing comments.
Thank you everyone for joining in for the Beluga webinar. And I am slightly sad to say this will be my last one for a little while. I will be away from NatHab for about 4 months, but I will be back in the springtime and very excited to jump back into these. So um, in the meantime, everyone enjoy your holidays, enjoy your family, um, and enjoy all the places you may be traveling to. And think about all the connections of how and why you travel to those places. And maybe some of those might even be family driven.
Thank you, Christina. Enjoy your time away. We look forward to having you back. And thank you for presenting for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. If you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, please give us a call at the number on your screen, or you can send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us tomorrow for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out this week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.